This story tells us about a man whose life, once quiet and predictable, was suddenly swept into chaos because of a war he never expected. Jonathan had spent his whole life repairing televisions and radios. In his small town, people knew him as the calm man with steady hands who could make even the oldest, rustiest devices work like new again. Every day, he sat in his workshop surrounded by wires, circuit boards, and soldering irons, carefully restoring life to broken machines. For Jonathan, this wasn't just work. It was a habit, a ritual. Fixing something meant giving it a second chance. And in some way, he felt like he was giving people a little bit of joy back. An evening show, a favorite song, a family movie night. His workshop was always quiet, except for the low hum of transformers and the occasional snap of tools. He liked it that way. Everything had its place, each resistor, each screw, each wire. Neighbors joked that if Jonathan could repair a TV from a pile of scraps, he could probably fix a person's broken spirit too. Jonathan would smile softly and nod. He liked the idea of order, of things functioning correctly, of life being a little more predictable. But one night, everything changed. News of the war spread across the town like a cold wind. At first, Jonathan thought it was distant, something that would never touch him. War, he reasoned, was far away. Soldiers, battles, front lines, none of that belonged in his quiet life of radios and wires. But then came the notice. His skills were needed, not to carry a weapon, but to work with communications, signals, and intelligence. Suddenly, Jonathan's routine of repairing appliances was transformed into something that could save or end lives. Arriving at the military base, Jonathan felt out of place. Soldiers with rifles hardened by battle looked at him like he didn't belong. They handed him an old radio receiver, battered and outdated even by their standards. "Your job is to listen, to record, to report," said the commander. Jonathan nodded, unsure of what that really meant. The first few days were grueling. He sat for hours, surrounded by antennas and buzzing equipment, learning to identify interference, to distinguish signal from static, to notice the tiniest variations. The world of war was loud, chaotic, and frightening, unlike his quiet shop. Explosions echoed in the distance. Soldiers shouted. The constant threat of danger weighed on him. But Jonathan found a strange sense of focus. This work mattered. Every mistake could cost lives. Over the next weeks, he began noticing small irregularities in the frequencies. What others dismissed as noise, Jonathan's trained ears could detect as patterns. Years of attention to detail had taught him to observe what others missed. Soon, he realized that these signals weren't random. They were coded messages, potentially enemy communications. He began documenting everything meticulously, double-checking, triple-checking, tracing frequencies, and analyzing changes in signal strength. One night, as he sat in a dimly lit room surrounded by blinking lights on old receivers, he heard it, a faint, deliberate signal buried in static. It was almost imperceptible, easily overlooked by anyone without his experience. Jonathan traced it carefully, mapping out the pattern. His heart raced as he realized the meaning. An ambush was planned for an Allied supply convoy. Every second of delay could cost dozens of lives. He reported the signal immediately. The room went silent. Officers trained to rely on numbers and firepower struggled to believe that a technician with a radio could predict the enemy's moves. But Jonathan calmly explained his reasoning. The signal variations, the timing, the frequency shifts, all pointed to an imminent threat. The commander made the difficult decision to reroute the convoy. Later, it became clear that Jonathan's observation had saved many lives. That night, Jonathan understood something he had never realized before. His ordinary life, his steady hands, and his ability to notice small details had become a tool for survival. The quiet work of repairing radios in a small town had prepared him for this moment. From that day on, he was no longer just a technician. He was a guardian of lives, using his knowledge and precision to keep people safe. Jonathan became meticulous, listening to every frequency, tracking every unusual signal. His life, once ordinary and predictable, was now intertwined with danger and responsibility. Every noise could signal life or death. Every beep could change the course of an operation. And this was only the beginning. The real challenges of war were ahead, where every moment could be a test, and every signal could be the difference between life and death. The days after Jonathan's first signal warning passed were tense. The convoy had arrived safely, and some of the officers quietly acknowledged that his work mattered more than they had expected. Yet, Jonathan didn't feel proud, only more alert, more responsible, and more anxious. Each beep from his equipment carried the potential for disaster. His quiet life as a radio repairman had never prepared him for the weight of silence between signals, for the knowledge that a missed noise could mean death. At first, he tried to maintain his routine to keep a semblance of normalcy. He checked and double-checked connections, cleaned receivers, and even made notes as he would in his workshop back home. But now, each adjustment had consequences beyond a television turning on or a radio playing music. Here, a misstep could cost lives. He realized that the war was teaching him a harsher form of precision, one where mistakes could never be forgiven. The officers began to rely on him more. They would come to him with maps and requests, asking him to monitor multiple frequencies simultaneously to detect even the faintest signs of enemy activity. Jonathan learned to focus in a way he had never had to before, blocking out explosions, shouting soldiers, and the ever-present fear that someone could break through the perimeter. He listened not just with his ears, but with his mind, imagining the location of enemy units, predicting movements, connecting patterns, and anticipating attacks. Night after night, Jonathan sat alone in a small, dimly lit room with his old radio receivers, headphones pressed tightly to his ears. The hum of electricity, the static, the faint beeps, they all became a language he could read. Slowly, he began identifying the nuances. A particular frequency would rise and fall just before an enemy patrol moved. Another tone might indicate a supply drop or a reconnaissance mission. He realized that even amidst the chaos of war, there was a rhythm, a hidden order that he could detect. One evening, he heard a signal unlike any he had encountered before. It was subtle but deliberate, a series of short, rhythmic pulses buried deep in the static. Jonathan traced the frequency, cross-referenced it with previous patterns, and mapped it against known enemy positions. His stomach tightened. This was no routine message. The enemy was planning a coordinated attack on a small isolated outpost, one that supplied hundreds of soldiers at the front. If unnoticed, dozens of lives could be lost. He immediately reported the signal, carefully explaining his analysis and the likely target. The room fell silent. The commanding officer, a seasoned soldier with decades of experience, studied Jonathan's notes and frowned. "You think this is reliable?" he asked. Jonathan met his gaze, steady but tense. "I've traced it 3 times. The pattern is consistent with previous movements, I'm certain." The officer nodded reluctantly, realizing the gravity of the situation. A team was dispatched to intercept the ambush. Hours later, the outpost radioed in. The attack had been thwarted. Jonathan, sitting alone in the dark, allowed himself a brief moment of relief, but it was fleeting. He knew the war was far from over, and every day would bring new threats. The responsibility weighed heavily on him. Every frequency he monitored was a lifeline, and every oversight could be catastrophic. The soldiers began calling him the Listener. It was not a title he sought, but it carried respect and trust. He became part of the strategic planning, advising on movements, identifying hidden dangers, and coordinating with other communication teams. Yet, despite the recognition, Jonathan felt an almost unbearable isolation. In his workshop back home, the most difficult moments were when a machine refused to work. Here, the stakes were human lives. He could not afford mistakes, and yet fear and exhaustion often threatened to cloud his judgment. Jonathan's attention to detail became almost obsessive. He noticed things others overlooked: a slight delay in a transmission, a frequency that had been shifted by a few kilohertz, a signal repeated at an unusual hour. Each anomaly could indicate danger. Slowly, he became attuned not only to the sound of the signals, but to the silence in between them. In war, the absence of noise could be as telling as its presence. One night, as the camp slept uneasily under a pale moon, Jonathan heard a faint tapping on a long-abandoned frequency. It was irregular, almost random, but he recognized it instantly. Someone was moving behind enemy lines, trying to establish communication with an unknown group. He traced the signal for hours, cross-referencing it with other intercepted messages. Finally, he identified the location, a small village where civilians and soldiers had been trapped. Immediate action was required, but coordinating a rescue under enemy observation was risky. Jonathan briefed the officers, detailing the signal and potential dangers. A rescue operation was launched, guided in part by his observations. Days later, he received word that dozens of lives had been saved, but he didn't feel triumphant. Each success reminded him of the countless unknown dangers still out there. Each signal he might miss, each life dependent on his ability to hear what others could not. That night, Jonathan sat alone, headphones in place, eyes scanning the dim glow of his equipment. The war had taken him from a quiet workshop to a battlefield of sound and silence. He had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon was not a gun or a tank, but the ability to listen, to observe, and to act with precision. His ordinary life had prepared him in extraordinary ways, and every day reminded him that survival was built not on courage alone, but on attention, patience, and the willingness to hear what others refused to notice. Weeks passed, and Jonathan had settled into the rhythm of life as the Army's listener. He had become indispensable, the quiet force behind every successful operation that relied on communication and coordination. Yet, the more he learned, the heavier the burden felt. Every static-laden signal, every faint whisper of enemy activity reminded him that a single mistake could cost lives. He had no room for error. The enemy had begun to adapt. They changed frequencies more frequently, sending false signals and traps to confuse Allied intelligence. Jonathan spent hours decoding, cross-referencing, and analyzing patterns. His eyes grew weary from staring at screens and listening to static that never ceased. The fatigue weighed on him, yet he could not afford a lapse in vigilance. His comrades depended on him, and he knew that no amount of personal exhaustion could excuse a mistake. One evening, a message came through that didn't belong, a coded transmission buried beneath layers of noise. Jonathan's heart raced as he traced it, unraveling its patterns carefully. He realized it was a warning. The enemy had identified the location of a key supply depot. If the depot fell, hundreds of soldiers would be stranded without ammunition or medical supplies. Jonathan immediately briefed the commanding officers, outlining the message's origins and potential targets. Plans for a defense were drawn up swiftly. Using Jonathan's interpretation of the signals, teams were dispatched to reinforce the depot and set traps for approaching enemy forces. The tension was palpable. Jonathan could feel it in the hushed conversations of the officers, in the way soldiers moved silently, aware that danger was imminent. He sat in his small communications room, headphones pressed to his ears, tracing the enemy's signals and feeling the weight of every life depending on his ability to listen and act. The night of the potential attack was silent at first. The usual hum of activity in the camp was replaced by a tense stillness. Jonathan monitored every frequency, every pulse, aware that the slightest anomaly could signify the beginning of an assault. Hours passed, like minutes, each static-laden beep slicing through the quiet. Then a faint signal appeared, a series of irregular pulses. Jonathan recognized the pattern immediately. It was a diversion. The enemy sought to draw attention away from their true approach. With quick thinking, he communicated the warning to the command post. Soldiers moved to intercept the real threat, guided by Jonathan's interpretations. Explosions erupted in the distance, followed by a tense silence. Reports came in. The supply depot had been defended successfully, and the enemy's strategy had been thwarted. Jonathan allowed himself a brief sigh of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that the war was far from over. Jonathan's reputation grew among the officers. They called him the ear of the front, a man whose patience, skill, and determination had saved countless lives. But Jonathan remained humble. He knew that his work, though crucial, was invisible. Unlike the soldiers in the trenches, he did not see the immediate results of his actions. He only heard the echoes, traced the signals, and hoped his analysis had been correct. Sleep became a rare luxury. Even when he closed his eyes, Jonathan could hear the faint pulses in his mind, each one a reminder of the danger lurking nearby. He carried the responsibility of others' lives like a shadow, always present, never fully leaving him. And yet, he found a strange sense of purpose in the quiet vigilance, in the ability to detect what others could not, and to act decisively when it mattered most. Jonathan began to reflect on how his ordinary life had prepared him for this extraordinary role. Fixing radios and televisions had taught him attention to detail, patience, and the importance of careful observation. In the chaos of war, these skills had become lifelines. He realized that sometimes the most unlikely experiences could prepare a person for situations that seemed unimaginable. As days turned into weeks, Jonathan's confidence in his abilities grew, though so did the challenges. The enemy became more cunning, employing deceptive tactics, electronic jamming, and misinformation. Every signal had to be verified, every anomaly investigated, and every precaution taken. The pressure was immense, yet Jonathan found a rhythm, a flow in which his mind could dissect even the most complex transmissions. And then, one night, a signal arrived unlike any he had encountered before. It was subtle, faint, almost drowned in static, but Jonathan immediately recognized it as urgent. He traced its origin to a remote village behind enemy lines, where civilians and Allied soldiers had been trapped. Jonathan realized that this was more than a routine mission. This was a life-or-death situation. The responsibility was crushing, but he knew he could not hesitate. Every moment counted. Jonathan briefed the command post, outlining the precise timing and location of the impending threat. A rescue operation was launched, guided entirely by his analysis. As he sat in the dim light, headphones on, every pulse and static-filled tone carrying critical information, he understood the full weight of his role. He was no longer a mere technician. He was a guardian, a lifeline, and the unseen hand guiding soldiers through danger. Hours later, the mission was a success. Civilians and soldiers were rescued, and the enemy was repelled. Jonathan allowed himself a moment to breathe, but the relief was fleeting. In the silence that followed, he heard it again, the faint, irregular pulses that hinted at danger still lurking. His work was never done, and he knew that the war would continue to test his skills, patience, and resolve. Jonathan's journey had transformed him. From a quiet life repairing electronics, he had become the unseen sentinel of the battlefield. Every beep, every static-laden hum, every irregular pulse was a story, a warning, a lifeline. And though his work was invisible to most, he understood its profound impact. He was not a soldier in the conventional sense, yet his contribution had saved countless lives. And in the quiet of the communications room, Jonathan embraced the responsibility, knowing that his ordinary skills had become extraordinary tools for survival. Jonathan had grown accustomed to the constant hum of static, the faint beeps, and irregular pulses that filled his headphones. They were part of his life now, a rhythm he had learned to read like a map, a lifeline connecting him to soldiers, civilians, and the fragile chain of command stretched across the front. But nothing could have prepared him for the signal that arrived one stormy night, a signal that sent a chill down his spine before he even fully understood it. The transmission was faint, distorted by interference, yet undeniably urgent. Jonathan's eyes widened as he traced the frequency, careful to note every detail. This wasn't a routine warning or the usual reconnaissance chatter. The pulses were erratic, almost like a heartbeat, urgent but disjointed. He double-checked his equipment, recalibrated, and analyzed again. There was no mistake. Someone or something was signaling for help from deep behind enemy lines. As he decrypted the message, Jonathan's stomach tightened. It was a distress call, but not just for a small group of soldiers. The signal originated from a civilian settlement surrounded by enemy forces. The inhabitants were trapped with no hope of evacuation, and supplies were dwindling. Jonathan realized that if no action was taken immediately, countless lives could be lost. The weight of responsibility pressed on him like never before. He hurried to the command post, delivering his findings with urgency. Officers listened intently, recognizing the gravity of the situation. Jonathan outlined every detail: the frequency, the pattern, the timing, and the location. Plans were drawn up rapidly for a coordinated rescue, but Jonathan knew the success of the mission depended entirely on his ability to continue monitoring the enemy's movements. Any misstep could turn the operation into a disaster. Back in his communications room, Jonathan felt the tension tighten around him. The static seemed louder now, as if echoing the danger. Every pulse of the signal carried a weight that made his heart pound. Soldiers were mobilizing based on his analysis, moving cautiously through dangerous terrain, relying on a series of calculations and interpretations that only he could provide. Jonathan understood that he had become the invisible guide through a minefield of life and death decisions. Hours passed. Thunder rolled in the distance, mingling with the crackle of radios and the persistent hum of equipment. Jonathan traced the signal continuously, noting changes in frequency and intensity that indicated enemy movement. Each irregular pulse was a potential clue to the enemy's position. The room around him felt smaller, the world beyond the walls, reduced to the numbers, tones, and vibrations that he interpreted with painstaking precision. The operation began. Rescue teams advanced toward the settlement, avoiding patrols, ambushes, and improvised traps. Jonathan remained at his post, eyes glued to the screens, headphones pressed tightly. He felt every heartbeat of the operation as if it were his own. One wrong interpretation could send soldiers into an ambush, costing lives he was responsible for. The hours stretched on, each one a test of endurance, skill, and focus. Suddenly, a new set of signals appeared, this time intentionally deceptive. The enemy had learned to jam communications, using the same frequencies Jonathan relied upon. Panic threatened to rise in the command post as the team reported conflicting information. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and then meticulously filtered the static, separating the genuine distress signal from the decoys. His mind worked like a scalpel, cutting through the chaos to find clarity. Finally, after tense hours, Jonathan pinpointed the exact location of the civilians and mapped the enemy's patrol patterns. He relayed the data to the rescue teams, guiding them through hidden paths, away from danger zones and toward the trapped settlement. Explosions erupted in the distance as skirmishes broke out, yet the teams navigated skillfully, relying on Jonathan's insight. By dawn, the mission was complete. The civilians were safe, evacuated to secure areas, and the enemy's position had been disrupted. Relief swept over the command post, but Jonathan didn't allow himself to fully celebrate. He was exhausted, mentally and physically drained, yet aware that this victory was temporary. The war continued, and with it, the responsibility of being the unseen ear, the guide, the lifeline, remained. As he removed his headphones and stretched, Jonathan reflected on how far he had come. The ordinary skills of repairing radios and noticing subtle patterns had become extraordinary tools of survival. His work, invisible to most, had directly saved lives and shaped the course of events in ways that few could comprehend. He had become more than a technician. He was the silent guardian of the battlefield, listening to the whispers of danger and turning them into hope. Jonathan knew that tomorrow would bring new signals, new crises, and new decisions. The war was relentless, and so was his duty. Yet for the first time in days, he allowed himself to feel the quiet satisfaction of having made a difference, of having turned the intangible whispers of radio waves into tangible lives saved. The echoes of the night's danger would linger, but Jonathan embraced them as a reminder that even the most ordinary man, with patience, skill, and determination, could become a force for extraordinary good. The night after the successful evacuation, Jonathan thought he might finally catch a breath, a moment to let the adrenaline fade. But in the dim glow of the command post, the radios began to hum with irregular signals once again. At first, he assumed it was interference, echoes of the previous battle fading into the night. But soon, the irregular pulses sharpened into something deliberate, patterns he hadn't seen before. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing, listening intently. The signals were not just distress calls, they were warnings, coded transmissions that suggested enemy forces were regrouping, preparing for a counter-ambush. Jonathan's stomach tightened. The civilians had been safe only for a few hours. Now, more lives hung in the balance, dependent on his ability to read these ghostly messages hidden in static. Jonathan's hands moved with practiced precision over the radio dials, filtering, amplifying, and decoding. Each beep, each faint whisper through the line was a puzzle piece. He traced movements of enemy patrols, cross-referencing with satellite data and field reports. He realized the enemy had begun to anticipate the patterns of their own signals. Decoy transmissions were being used to mislead, to make it appear that soldiers were in locations where they were not. The task ahead was more complex than anything Jonathan had faced before. The clock ticked, minutes stretching into hours as Jonathan isolated the genuine warnings from false leads. Sweat dripped down his brow, his ears strained to catch subtle deviations in frequency, tiny anomalies that betrayed the enemy's true positions. He had learned over weeks of war that in the chaos, the smallest detail could mean the difference between life and death. One overlooked signal could send rescue teams into a trap. In the early hours, a new message arrived, this one clear but brief. Jonathan's heart raced as he decoded it. A convoy carrying wounded soldiers was moving along a narrow mountain pass. Intelligence suggested the enemy had set mines and snipers along the route. Jonathan understood immediately. Without timely guidance, the convoy would be destroyed. His mind raced to calculate the safest paths, the moments when the enemy would be least alert, the exact timing for each maneuver. He relayed instructions to the convoy commander with precision, down to the second. Move 5 meters forward, wait 3 minutes, then proceed to the left ridge. Watch the northern slope for movement, he spoke, voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. Soldiers followed his guidance as if they could see through his mind, trusting the unseen analyst whose insight was now the lifeline of the mission. Meanwhile, Jonathan noticed another pattern emerging. The enemy was attempting to jam his frequency, sending bursts of static to confuse him. His equipment emitted a high-pitched shriek intermittently, a warning that signals were being corrupted. Jonathan didn't panic. He adjusted filters, recalibrated the antenna, and even used old manual techniques he had learned from years repairing radios. His experience, once mundane, was now extraordinary. Each adjustment, each subtle tweak, saved precious seconds that meant survival. Hours passed, like days. Jonathan's focus never wavered, though fatigue clawed at him. Outside, the mountains were shrouded in darkness and storm clouds, the wind carrying distant echoes of artillery fire. The convoy made its way cautiously, guided by Jonathan's continuous updates. Several near misses occurred, troops barely dodging hidden explosives. But his timing was perfect. His calculations, his understanding of the enemy's tricks were flawless. One wrong decision, and the night could have ended in disaster. Finally, just before dawn, the convoy reached the safety of a secured base. Soldiers disembarked, exhausted but alive, their eyes wide with relief. Jonathan removed his headphones, feeling the tension of the night drain from his shoulders. Yet even in relief, he knew the war was far from over. Every success painted a new target on his back. The enemy had learned that one ordinary man with extraordinary focus could disrupt their plans with nothing more than sound waves and calculated patterns. Jonathan stepped outside the command post, the cold air sharp against his skin. He looked at the rising sun, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to imagine a life beyond the constant hum of radios and the endless signals of danger. But he quickly reminded himself the war would continue, and somewhere someone would need his ears, his mind, his invisible guidance. Tonight had been a victory, but the shadows in the static were always waiting, and Jonathan knew he would face them again as long as there were lives depending on him, unseen, unheard, yet indispensable. The days following the convoy's safe arrival offered no rest. If Jonathan had allowed himself a moment to relax, the hum of static in his mind would have reminded him that the war was far from over. The enemy had learned his previous success had not gone unnoticed. Signals intercepted from their communications hinted at a new strategy. Decoys, jamming, and misdirection intensified, designed specifically to challenge his ears, his mind, and his intuition. Jonathan adjusted the equipment in the command post, meticulously checking each wire and component. His old radio technician's instincts kicked in, guiding his hands as he filtered frequencies, refined amplifiers, and tuned the receivers. Even the smallest miscalibration could give away the lives of soldiers moving through the terrain. Every beep, every faint static pulse became a clue, a puzzle piece revealing the enemy's intentions. The first alert came just past midnight. A series of rapid, irregular bursts appeared on multiple channels, overlapping and conflicting with each other. Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he analyzed the signals. Someone was trying to overload him to make the communications incomprehensible, but experience and instinct told him that within the chaos there was a pattern. Carefully, he isolated the true transmissions, identifying their source. The enemy was establishing ambush points along a narrow river pass, one that Allied reinforcements would inevitably take. Lives were at stake, and time was slipping away. Jonathan grabbed a notebook and began mapping coordinates, tracing enemy movements against the terrain he had memorized. He calculated line-of-sight angles, potential blind spots, and likely sniper positions. For each calculation, he cross-referenced the radio signals, adjusting for interference intentionally introduced to deceive him. The complexity of the task would have overwhelmed anyone else. But Jonathan thrived in the unseen, the inaudible, the details that most would dismiss as background noise. Hours passed, with no room for error. The enemy escalated further, launching counter-signals designed to mimic friendly communications. Jonathan recognized the deception when a false distress call arrived from a supposed convoy. The trap was set. If he misled Allied forces, they would walk straight into an ambush. His hands moved faster, adjusting filters and amplifiers, isolating the original signals from the fake ones. One slip, one overlooked pulse, could mean death. Meanwhile, the operators around him worked tirelessly, relaying Jonathan's precise instructions to units in the field. Soldiers trusted him implicitly, their faith in the unseen analyst steady, as the signals continued to pour in. Jonathan felt a growing weight on his shoulders. He was not only decoding enemy movements, he was orchestrating the safety of dozens of lives. And now the enemy knew him. They adapted, learned, and changed their approach, forcing Jonathan to adapt in return. Hours turned into a tense cycle of decoding, directing, and monitoring. Every intercepted message revealed more about enemy tactics. They had begun to rotate positions, using decoy signals to mask their main forces. Jonathan realized that the traditional patterns he relied on were no longer sufficient. He needed intuition as much as skill. Closing his eyes for a brief second, he imagined the movements on the terrain, visualizing the forces as if he could see them with his mind's eye. His fingers danced across the dials, adjusting, recalibrating, anticipating the enemy's next move before it even became clear in the signals. The first test of his new strategy came within hours. A column of reinforcements began their movement toward the river pass following the expected route. Enemy forces waited, hidden, ready to strike. Jonathan instructed the column to take an alternate path, one only he could determine by reading the subtle cues in the radio transmissions. Moments later, an explosion rocked the abandoned path, a decoy mine left precisely to trap the unsuspecting. Jonathan exhaled. Lives had been saved, but the enemy was clever, and the war was far from over. By dawn, Jonathan had predicted multiple enemy positions, rerouted 2 separate convoys, and prevented countless potential casualties. He looked at the morning light creeping into the mountains, exhausted yet unbroken. The enemy had learned, but so had he. And in the silent moments between the static and the hum of radios, he realized a truth that had become his constant companion. Even unseen, unheard, and unarmed, he was a force that could change the course of battle. But Jonathan knew this was only the beginning. The enemy would continue to evolve. Their countermeasures would become deadlier, their deception more sophisticated, and with each passing day he would have to dig deeper into his knowledge, rely on instincts honed through years of practice, and trust in the subtle whispers hidden in the static. Tonight, he thought, the battle had been won, but tomorrow would bring a new challenge, one that might push him beyond every limit he had ever known. The war had made him indispensable, yet it also made him a target. Every successful interception painted a larger mark on his back, and Jonathan knew the next signal he heard might not just be a warning, it could be a call to face the enemy directly. Jonathan had learned to read the language of silence, to hear the unspoken signals hidden between bursts of static. But tonight, the radio waves carried something different, something heavy, calculated, and ominous. He sat hunched over the console, eyes scanning every blip, every interference, searching for meaning. Somewhere, out there, the enemy was preparing something unprecedented. He could feel it in the rhythm of the signals, in the deliberate pauses that weren't accidental. The transmissions were fragmented, scattered across multiple frequencies, each with the deceptive patterns to mislead any listener. Jonathan's hands moved with precision, twisting dials and adjusting filters, isolating the true message from the noise. The enemy was attempting a large-scale ambush, one designed not just to kill soldiers, but to trap them entirely, cutting off any possibility of escape. He traced the signals to a valley that seemed innocent on the map, but he knew better. He had learned that war often hid its deadliest secrets in the most ordinary places. He called the commanders in the field, his voice calm but urgent. Do not proceed on the planned route. I've intercepted enemy positions. They've set up a crossfire in the valley. I have an alternative path, but you must trust my calculations." For hours, Jonathan directed movements with meticulous care, rerouting vehicles, coordinating foot patrols, and sending signals to units that didn't even realize they were in a trap. His old life of repairing radios seemed trivial compared to the stakes now. Every adjustment could mean life or death. But the enemy was cunning. They had predicted that someone might intercept their communications. Faintly, Jonathan detected a signal that mimicked his own directives, attempting to confuse the convoy and lure them back toward the ambush. Heart racing, he deciphered the fake from the real, using patterns only he could detect. It was a game of cat and mouse across the airwaves, and failure was unacceptable. Lives depended on his intuition, his experience, and his ability to remain several steps ahead of an invisible adversary. Hours melted into night. The convoy moved cautiously under Jonathan's guidance, each vehicle following his exact instructions. He monitored every deviation, every faint static blip that might indicate danger. And then it happened. A sudden burst of signals indicated an explosion. One of the decoy mines had been triggered, but the convoy had already been rerouted thanks to his timely intervention. Relief was fleeting. He knew the enemy's main force was still ahead, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jonathan felt the tension in his shoulders tighten. He worked tirelessly, recalculating angles, predicting enemy maneuvers, adjusting frequencies, and sending precise instructions to units over encrypted channels. The enemy attempted multiple deception tactics: fake reinforcements, false distress calls, and signal jamming. Each time, Jonathan countered, using his unparalleled skill in radio technology and his deep understanding of human behavior. He could almost hear the enemy adjusting, panicking, as their carefully laid plans crumbled under the guidance of a single, unarmed man with an old radio. Dawn broke, revealing the aftermath of the night's maneuvers. The ambush had failed completely. The enemy's traps were discovered, their positions exposed, and the convoy had passed safely through the valley. Soldiers whispered his name with respect and awe, some unaware of exactly how close they had come to disaster. Jonathan leaned back, exhausted, feeling the weight of the night pressing on him. He had saved dozens of lives, yet the war was far from over. As he reviewed the intercepted signals, he noticed a chilling pattern. The enemy had learned from tonight's failure. Their signals were changing more rapidly now, their deception more intricate. They would strike again, and the next trap could be even deadlier. Jonathan realized the terrifying truth. Every life he saved made him a more crucial target. Every intercepted plan made the enemy more aware of his capabilities. And yet, he couldn't stop. He couldn't allow fear to compromise the safety of those relying on him. For the first time in weeks, Jonathan allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The war had transformed him from a simple radio technician into a lifeline for hundreds of people. He had learned to navigate silence, to see patterns where others saw chaos, and to act decisively when everything seemed lost. But the enemy was evolving too, and somewhere, hidden in the mountains, they were already preparing a challenge that would push his skills, his intuition, and his courage to the absolute limit. Tonight had been a victory, yes, but Jonathan knew the war was far from over, and he also knew that the next time he heard the faint hum of a signal through the static, It could mark the beginning of his most dangerous test yet. Jonathan sat in the dim glow of his makeshift radio station, the hum of machinery and the faint static of countless frequencies filling the room. He had grown accustomed to this rhythm, the ebb and flow of signals, the whispers hidden in the white noise, the way danger announced itself quietly to those who knew how to listen. Yet tonight felt different. There was a weight in the air, a sense of inevitability that pressed against his chest like the silence before a storm. The enemy had become relentless, their tactics more devious, their traps more lethal. Jonathan had intercepted fragments of chatter that hinted at an unprecedented strike, one that could decimate an entire battalion if he failed to decipher it. Every ounce of his training, every late night spent tweaking frequencies and decoding patterns had led to this moment. He understood the stakes. One misread signal, one moment of hesitation, and dozens of lives could be lost. He began scanning, adjusting dials with practiced precision. The enemy's communications were layered with false codes and misleading patterns, designed to overwhelm even the most experienced ears. But Jonathan had a gift, an intuition honed over years of listening, repairing, and understanding the hidden language of machines. He traced subtle irregularities, noting shifts in tone, timing, and repetition. Slowly, the true message emerged from the chaos. Coordinates, timing, and instructions for a coordinated ambush meant to trap his allies. Heart-pounding, he relayed the information immediately, giving commanders new directives to reroute and reinforce. The convoy moved cautiously, each vehicle following his precise guidance. Jonathan's mind raced as he monitored every movement, every signal, every potential hazard. The enemy's countermeasures were swift, trying to mimic his voice, sending false distress calls and jamming channels with overwhelming interference. Yet, with each attempt, Jonathan countered, using his knowledge of frequencies and human behavior to stay one step ahead. Hours passed in tense vigilance. Jonathan's fingers ached from constant adjustments. His eyes burned from the flickering lights of the radio panels. Yet he persisted, aware that any lapse could be catastrophic. He could almost feel the enemy watching, anticipating his next move, and then finally a pattern emerged, a repetition in the chaos, a flaw in their otherwise flawless deception. Jonathan seized the opportunity, sending carefully timed counter-signals that neutralized the ambush before it could strike. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, the convoy emerged from the danger zone unharmed. Soldiers looked around in disbelief at the devastation the enemy had prepared, now rendered useless. Jonathan felt a surge of relief, tempered by exhaustion. He had done what many believed impossible. He had outsmarted an unseen enemy, using only his skill, patience, and the quiet power of observation. Yet even in victory, Jonathan knew the war had left its mark. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him. He had been the invisible hand guiding lives away from death. Yet invisible hands are rarely recognized. His camera had never captured his contribution. No medal would fully acknowledge the nights spent deciphering the hum of danger, the hours spent listening when others slept. And yet, he felt a quiet pride. He had turned knowledge into survival, skill into salvation, and silence into life. As he finally leaned back, allowing exhaustion to wash over him, a faint signal flickered across the console, too brief to interpret fully, yet familiar enough to chill him. Jonathan realized that the enemy had learned from their defeat. The war was not over, and the signals would keep coming. He smiled faintly, though weariness weighed him down. He was ready. Every frequency, every vibration, every hidden whisper in the static would be his weapon. The final signal was not an ending. It was a reminder. The war would continue, but so would the man who could hear what others could not. And in that quiet understanding, Jonathan found his purpose. He had become more than a radio technician. He had become the lifeline, the unseen protector, the ear that could save countless lives. And as long as the signals reached him, he would be ready. Silence returned to the room, but Jonathan knew better. Somewhere, beyond the mountains, in the shadows of uncertainty, the next signal was already waiting, and he would be there to hear it.